I think we're good to go. Here we are at Random Thoughts from County Antrim. Welcome and falcha. This is January 10, 2021. And it's my half hour-ish, maybe a little shorter today. But of stories, yarns, historical information, and of course, my random thoughts. This past week was huge. In part on the home front and in part in the country at large. On the home front first, it was my anniversary. My wife and I have been married many, many decades, a lot of decades, and I won't tell you how many. But I did look it up. I looked up to see what the traditional gift was for the X number of years that my wife and I had been married. You know, like it's the silver anniversary is the 25th, the golden anniversary is the 50th. Well, what is it for our number of years? And I looked it up. I looked it up on the internet, which is the answer to all questions. Oh, by the way, we got Alexa for Christmas, and I should have asked Alexa what's the traditional gift for this anniversary, but I didn't do that. Instead, I just looked it up on the internet. And what I discovered is that there are no traditional gifts for our number of years of marriage. At least not the American tradition, in the American tradition, or for that matter, the tradition of any English-speaking country. What I did discover, though, if we lived in Germany or Russia or France, the traditional gift for our number of years of marriage would be cedar. And if we lived in Spain or Italy, the traditional gift for this anniversary would be zircon. Now, I don't even know what zircon is. And I do have some scraps of cedar in my workshop that were left over from a project I worked on a year or so ago and kept the spare wood. But I didn't think it was a good idea to give my wife scraps of wood for our anniversary. So I gave her nothing. Because that may be, in fact, turns out, appropriate, since there is no traditional gift for our number of years of marriage. In honor of our anniversary, somebody posted a photo of my wife and I on our wedding day, and we received a lot of nice comments. And thank you all for the comments and the well wishes to us. One of the comments, though, cracked me up. Not cracked me up, but one of them was amazing. Somebody posted that my wife on her wedding day was gorgeous. And she was. And frankly, she still is. And I'm just one of those guys lucky enough to have married a trophy wife on my first try. Now, of course, there was other huge events in the past week, and that's the attempted coup, the attempted overthrow of the government of the United States of America by force. It was something I never expected to see in my lifetime. Many commentators, when they were talking about this, compared us to a banana republic. And I saw a comment by ex-President George W. Bush, as well as from others, that said this comparison was unfair to the banana republics. Now, the term, if you ever heard it, the term banana republic's been around for quite a while. It's used to describe, usually derogatorily, to Latin American countries, which can be characterized by unstable governments and often one-crop economies dominated by foreign capital. And the phrase really came from the era, which was much of the 20th century, in which the United Fruit Company had a monopoly over much of South America and their fruit industry, particularly bananas, but other fruit. And there was tremendous, still is to an extent, but before, certainly in the 20th century, much instability, political instability, caused by the American domination of the economies of these countries, with governments propped up by American aid and sometimes even the CIA, and then periodic pushbacks from the locals. But the complaint that they had, the complaint people had, is that what we saw in our capital had nothing to do with anyone else but ourselves. We brought it on ourselves. And it was an eye-opener, or at least it should have been. We always thought it could only happen somewhere else. And here, it happened to us here. In any event, I hadn't planned on talking about current events today. I had thought about telling you a story, and a week ago, even before all these events in Washington, D.C., I picked out a story I wanted to tell. Again, unrelated to the events of the week. So I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to tell you that story. And the story is called The Apprentice and the Baker. Now, there was a young apprentice who lived in a small village in Donegal in the west of Ireland, and he earned a small wage from his employer while learning his trade, but it was barely enough to pay his rent. Very little left over after his rent. He lived in a single room above a bakery in the village. And the room had but one window, and just enough space for his bedroll and his meager belongings, because he didn't have much. Now, once in a while, the apprentice had enough money to buy some food, and once in a while, people in the village would give him something, a spare potato or an egg or some leftover stew. And he usually got lunch while he was working from his employer, but it wasn't much of a lunch. His employer didn't have a great deal of money either. So the apprentice boy barely scraped by in terms of food. Now, the baker, who had his bakery underneath the room of the apprentice boy, was a very, very talented man. He made some of the best baked goods in all of Donegal. He baked bread, he baked pastries and cookies, but he's probably most famous for his cakes. People came to this village from miles and miles around just for the delight of his cakes. And when he baked his cakes, the aroma from the bakery just spilled out into the street and into the entire village. And everyone enjoyed the delightful aroma from those cakes. Now, the baker usually sold everything he made, and he was very particular about the freshness of his goods. If something did not sell on the day he baked it, he would throw it away. He refused to give anything away because he had a fear that people would wait for the day-old free stuff rather than buying his freshly baked goods. So instead, what he did is he dug a pit in the back of the bakery, and from time to time he threw over whatever didn't sell into the pit, covered up with some dirt. Now, the apprentice boy saw him do this once, and he saw the baker go out to the back of the bakery and throw away excess bread. And the one time the apprentice saw this was all it took. From thereafter, every day after the bake shop closed, the apprentice snuck out, went to the back of the bakery, dug open the pit, and grabbed the day-old stale bread. And that old stale bread provided the apprentice boy with just the sustenance he needed to survive. Now, there's only one problem, of course, with stale bread, and that is, it's stale bread. It had no flavor. There's no aroma. It was simply plain day-old bread. But the apprentice boy ate it anyway, because he was hungry, and he didn't have anything else to eat. Now, one morning when the apprentice boy was getting ready to go to work, and the apprentice boy was delayed a little bit. He was a little later than he usually goes to work. He's usually off to work before the baker gets started. But he was delayed one morning, and he could smell, as he was getting ready to go to work, he could smell this aroma from the bread seeping through the ceiling of the bakery and through the floor of his room, and filling his room with this wonderful aroma of freshly baked cakes. The baker was already at work, baking his cakes. And to the poor apprentice boy, this was one of the best experiences he ever had, to be able to smell the aroma of these cakes before he went to work. So then the apprentice boy rushed to his window, and he opened up his window, and to his great delight, the aroma from the cakes was filling the street and rising up to his window. And so he had a brilliant idea. He still had some bread from the night before. So the apprentice boy took took a piece of bread that he had from a loaf, and he stuck it out the window. And as he stuck it out, the aroma of the cakes was seeping up from the bakery and seeping into the bread. So then the apprentice boy brought the bread in from the window, took a sniff, and the bread smelled delicious. A soaked up aroma from that cake. So he held it out some more, soaking in more of the aroma of the cakes. And when he could stand it no longer, he grabbed the bread, took a bite, and it was the best bread he had ever tasted. And it was indeed the best breakfast, I think, this apprentice boy ever had. So thereafter, the apprentice boy followed the same practice. He delayed him going to work every morning until the baker started to bake his cakes. And at night, he would save whatever bread he had gathered. And in the morning, he would hold the bread out the window to soak in the aroma from the cakes. And he had this delicious bread with the aroma of the cakes as his breakfast every morning. Now, one morning, and it was near the end of the apprentice boy's apprenticeship, but one morning the baker walked out of his shop while the cakes were being cooked in the oven. And he was chatting with some people on the street, inviting them in to buy his cakes. And it was at that exact moment that the apprentice boy had a piece of bread stuck out the window to absorb the aroma from the cakes. And the baker looked up, and he saw this. And at first he wondered what was going on, and then it dawned on him what was going on. He realized that the apprentice boy was using the aroma of his cakes to absorb into the apprentice boy's bread. So the baker shouted to the apprentice, "Boy, you come down here right this minute." The apprentice boy complied after eating a slice of bread, and he went down the stairs and into the street. And the baker yelled at him. He said, "I saw what you were doing. You were stealing the aroma from my cakes." And the apprentice boy admitted this. He said, "Yes, I was using the aroma from your cakes to improve the flavor of my bread, but I didn't know it was a crime to do so." "Oh, it certainly is," said the baker. "You're using the aroma of my cakes without paying for them. You owe me money for the aroma you have been stealing. I'm taking you to see the magistrate." And the baker grabbed the apprentice by the ear and just kind of tugged him, pulled him down the street, all the way to the village magistrate. Now, the village magistrate was a well-respected man, but also a feared man, because the magistrate heard all the criminal cases in the village, as well as all civil disputes. He had the power to evict a tenant make him homeless. He could order someone to jail in a criminal case, or perhaps be sent off to Australia. And if you could not pay a debt, the magistrate could put you in prison, because that was a crime at the time. So everyone feared the magistrate. Now, the magistrate was in session that morning, and the baker just stomped into the courtroom, still pulling the apprentice boy by the ear. And the baker says, "I demand justice." And the magistrate looked at him and says, "And it is justice that you shall receive, but first you have to wait your turn. I have a few other matters to resolve here this morning." Now, it was about an hour or so later before the magistrate finished his other business. And then he looked at the baker and says, "Okay, we're ready. What seems to be your problem?" Well, the baker says, "I'm the village baker, and I own the bakery in town." And the magistrate replied, he says, I'm very familiar with your bakery, but why is that young man in my courtroom?" The baker said, "He's the tenant on the room above my bakery. I caught him in the act of stealing from me." So the magistrate asked, "What is it that he stole from you?" And the baker replied, "He stole aroma from my cakes. I caught him with his arm out his window and a piece of bread, and he was soaking the bread in the aroma of my cakes, and he did not pay for that aroma. He's probably been doing this for a long, long time. He must pay for the aroma that he has stolen from me." Well, the magistrate said, "That is a serious indeed, serious charge." And he looked over to the apprentice boy and he said, "What do you have to say for yourself?" The apprentice said, "Well, I indeed used the aroma from the cakes to make my meager rations tastier, but I did not know that there was a law against this." "Well," the magistrate said, I really have no choice but to find you guilty as charged. You used the aroma of his cakes, the baker's cakes, without paying for them." Well, the apprentice boy said, "I'm just a poor apprentice, and I have but 2 pennies to my name." So the magistrate said, "Well, then, you shall pay 2 pennies to the baker for using the aroma of his cakes." Now, the baker smiled. He's quite pleased with the ruling. I mean, 2 pennies is not much, but at least he would be paid something. He would be paid everything, in fact, that the apprentice boy owned. And perhaps this ruling would be a deterrent from others from stealing the aroma of his cakes. The apprentice boy, in contrast, was a bit disappointed. He only had 2 pennies, and now he had to pay them to the baker. So he reached deep into his right pocket. It just reached and looked and felt, and he pulled out a penny. And he put that penny on the table. And then he reached on his left pocket and stuck way in the pocket, fishing around, trying to find out where that other penny was, if indeed he had another penny. And he pulled it out. And he put that one on the table as well. And both pennies, as you just heard, made that familiar sound of money when it falls upon a table. The magistrate then said to the apprentice boy, says, "Now that you have placed 2 pennies on the table, you may pick them up and put them back into your pockets." The apprentice boy was surprised by that, but he did as he told. He picked up his 2 pennies, and after he picked them up, he put them back in his pocket. The baker, on the other hand, was furious. He says, "You found him guilty of stealing the aroma from my cakes. I am entitled to be paid." To which the magistrate responded, "If you are entitled to charge the apprentice boy for the aroma of your cakes, then he is entitled to pay you with the sound of his money. And that's the story of the apprentice and the baker. Now, I've told this story many, many times. I'm not sure of its origins. I found some references, because I did some research on this, and I found some references to sound of money stories in various forms. From the Middle East, from China, from elsewhere. And there is, as you might imagine, many, many versions of the story with different themes that go in different directions, different types of characters, different kinds of dialogue and process, but the same general theme that end with the sound of money. So I decided to put my own twist on the story when I had heard it, and of course I made the setting a small Irish village with Irish characters to make it an Irish story, but it is an old story with many, many variations and many, many points of origin. Now, there is indeed a moral to the story, and I'm not really sure what the moral of the story is. But there's an element of greed in the story. And there's the baker who's overreaching, claiming to own something that he doesn't own, claiming a right that he has no right to. And of course, the story ends with justice. So as I started this podcast, and I mentioned to you before, I didn't choose this story because of the events in Washington, D.C. this week, but upon reflection, I think it's an entirely appropriate story. Because what we did see last week were claims by people to something that they have no right to claim. And perhaps what we will see now and soon is justice. So that's the end of my podcast this week. As I said, I wanted to do less than 20 minutes, or less than 30 minutes, because I went over a little bit. And when I started these podcasts, I promised they would always be 30 minutes or less. And I went over a couple of times. So perhaps by cutting this one a little short, on average, I'll keep my promise. So please take a look at my website, clandonnell.net. Send me an email at clandonnell@gmail.com. Like and share my Facebook page. And please take a look at my books if you don't have them already. And if you do have them, or whether you have them or don't, take a look at the website and read some of the stories that I've posted. I've been posting stories left and right. So all you can do in a pandemic is kind of organize your old stories and write new ones. So I've been adding a lot of content to my website, mainly stories, because that's what I do. So that's the end of the podcast today. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye.